There exists a photograph that has largely remained unseen. It captures Dodi Al-Fayed leaning back in a chair, his laughter echoing from something just beyond the lens. An image of complete relaxation and vibrant life. This image was taken a mere 48 hours before his untimely death. While much of the public discourse has understandably focused on her, a figure of immense global fascination, far less attention has been paid to him, the man in the passenger seat. This is about who he truly was, the fabric of his life, and the conclusions reached by official inquiries regarding the tragic end of his story. Our aim today is to delve into the true identity of Dodi Al-Fayed. Imad Eldin Mohammed Abdel Munim Fayed was born in Alexandria, Egypt, on April 15, 1955. For the vast majority, he was known simply as Dodi, and more specifically, as the son of Mohammed Al-Fayed, the immensely wealthy businessman who owned the renowned Harrods department store in London and the opulent Hotel Ritz, Paris. This was the image consistently portrayed by the tabloids, the affluent socialite, the heir apparent, a man who navigated the world on the strength of his father's fortune and name. However, those who knew him personally painted a picture of a far more nuanced individual. Dodi's upbringing was largely separate from his father's direct influence. His parents divorced when he was very young, and he was predominantly raised by his maternal family, spending his formative years in Egypt and later in Switzerland. His mother, Samira Khashoggi, was the sister of arms dealer Adnan Khashoggi, a lineage that placed Dodi within a world of extraordinary affluence on both sides of his family tree. Such an upbringing inevitably leaves its imprint, fostering a sense of always being on the periphery, observing from the threshold of another's domain. He pursued his education at the distinguished Royal Military Academy Sandhurst in England, the same esteemed institution that trains officers for the British Army, although he did not complete the full program. He also briefly attended the London Film School. These academic pursuits might seem easily overlooked, yet they are significant as they reveal a person actively seeking direction rather than passively drifting. By the mid-1970s, he had established himself in London, eventually finding himself drawn to the film industry. This chapter of his life is often inadequately covered, but it is genuinely compelling. Dodi was not merely a passive investor who bankrolled projects for superficial prestige. He actively contributed. He served as an executive producer on the critically acclaimed 1981 film Chariots of Fire, which went on to win the Academy Award for Best Picture. His involvement extended to other productions throughout the 1980s and 90s, including FX in 1986 and Hook in 1991, the latter being the Steven Spielberg production starring Robin Williams. Colleagues from these film productions recalled him as enthusiastic, occasionally disorganized, but profoundly dedicated to the art of storytelling. Accounts from those who worked with him consistently describe a warmth that contrasted with his public persona. He was known for remembering birthdays, returning calls, and displaying a genuine, unfeigned enthusiasm for new ideas. His romantic life was also well documented. Over the years, he dated several prominent women, including actresses and models, whose names frequently graced the gossip pages throughout the 1980s. In 1986, he married Suzanne de Castellan, a model, though the union lasted a mere 8 months. Following their divorce, he remained unmarried for the remainder of his life, despite persistent tabloid speculation about imminent proposals. By the summer of 1997, Dodi Al-Fayed was 42 years old. He divided his time between London and Los Angeles, actively engaged in film projects. It was during this period that he formed a close connection with someone whose presence would thrust both of them into an unprecedented level of public scrutiny. That individual, of course, was Diana. The summer of 1997 marked the beginning of the relationship between Dodi Al-Fayed and Diana, Princess of Wales, though their initial meeting had occurred years prior at a polo match. Mohammed Al-Fayed, Dodi's father, had been a long-standing acquaintance of Diana's family. In early July of 1997, he extended an invitation to Diana and her sons, William and Harry, to join the Al-Fayed family for a holiday in the south of France. This invitation was presented as an informal, convivial getaway, an opportunity for the young princes to enjoy a summer respite from the relentless press attention that perpetually followed Diana. What unfolded during those weeks became one of the most extensively photographed and widely speculated upon relationships of the entire decade. Diana and Dodi were captured together incessantly, on yachts, on beaches, in ports along the Mediterranean coast. The photographs commanded exorbitant sums, with virtually every major tabloid in Britain, France, and beyond meticulously tracking their movements. Editors were prepared to offer figures that, even by the standards of 1990s celebrity journalism, were considered exceptional. The British tabloid press had been fixated on Diana since her emergence onto the public stage in the early 1980s. For 16 years, they had chronicled her marriage, her personal struggles, her charitable endeavors, her friendships, and her romantic relationships. By the summer of 1997, the public appetite for images of her had not waned. If anything, it had intensified. She was newly divorced, actively redefining her public image, and was perceived by the press and a significant segment of the public as the most captivating figure globally. The news of her burgeoning romance with Dodi fueled further intense public interest. The question of the relationship's genuine depth, whether it was a fleeting summer dalliance or something more profound, became a subject of fervent public debate. Accounts from Diana's confidants varied. Those close to Dodi offered differing perspectives to various journalists. One individual close to Diana described her as experiencing a genuine happiness not seen in years. Others adopted a more cautious stance, suggesting it was too early to ascertain the relationship's ultimate significance. What is undeniably documented is the following. By August of 1997, Diana and Dodi had spent considerable time together across multiple occasions. Their public appearances, captured in photographs, left little room for doubt that their connection extended beyond mere friendship. By the final week of August, they were together in Paris. Reports, though unverified and still subject to dispute, circulated that Dodi had acquired a ring from Reposi, a jeweler situated near Place Vendôme in Paris. The press referred to this as an engagement ring, yet the true nature of its significance, and whether any formal matrimonial plans had been discussed, remained conclusively unestablished. The British inquest heard testimony from the jeweler's family and staff at the Ritz, presenting an ambiguous picture consistent with someone serious about the relationship, but lacking definitive proof of a proposal. What is not disputed is that on the evening of August 30th, 1997, Dodi and Diana shared dinner at the Hotel Ritz Paris, a property owned by his father. Following their meal, they made a decision about how to spend the remainder of the night. That decision marked a pivotal turning point, irrevocably altering the course of events. The Ritz, the paparazzi, and the unfolding plan. In August of 1997, the Hotel Ritz Paris was, by all accounts, not a location where Diana, Princess of Wales, could move with any degree of discretion. At that juncture, she was arguably the most photographed woman on Earth. Her divorce from Prince Charles had been finalized the preceding year. She had significantly scaled back her official royal duties. She had granted the interview that sent shockwaves through the British establishment, and she was spending the summer in the company of a man the press had already labelled her boyfriend. Dodi and Diana had arrived in Paris on August 30th, following a sojourn in Sardinia. They were staying at the Ritz in the Imperial Suite. Earlier that afternoon, they had visited the Villa Windsor, the historic residence of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, following their abdication, a property owned and renovated by Dodi Al-Fayed. The staff noted this visit, and it was later reported in the press as potentially significant, although the substance of any discussions between Dodi and Diana there, if indeed there were any meaningful ones, was never ascertained. They dined that evening in their suite, having opted against the main restaurant due to the throngs of people and media attention outside. Hotel staff described the dinner as relaxed. They remained there for several hours. The presence of paparazzi outside the Ritz that evening was described by witnesses as overwhelming. Photographers had congregated in substantial numbers on the Place Vendôme, anticipating their appearance. Some had been waiting for hours. The sheer scale of the operation, the motorcycles, the cameras, the constant repositioning as news spread that the couple was inside, escalated beyond typical press coverage into something akin to a siege. The initial plan for Dodi and Diana that evening was to depart the Ritz and proceed to Dodi's apartment on Rue Arsène Houssaye, near the Arc de Triomphe. This would have been a relatively short drive through Paris. However, as the evening progressed and the crowd of photographers outside showed no signs of dispersing, an alternative plan was devised. The concept involved a diversionary tactic. Two vehicles were to depart from the front of the hotel, drawing the photographers' attention. Meanwhile, Dodi and Diana would discreetly exit through a rear entrance on Rue Cambon and board a different vehicle. That vehicle was a black Mercedes S280. The individual behind the wheel was Henri Paul. Henri Paul. This is the juncture where the narrative becomes intensely scrutinized by investigators, journalists, and legal teams, who spent years attempting to fully comprehend the events. Henri Paul was 40 years old. He held the position of deputy head of security at the Hotel Ritz, Paris, and had been serving as acting head since June of 1997. Colleagues described him as competent, professional, and well-regarded. He had been employed at the Ritz for many years and was considered an individual intimately familiar with the hotel, its clientele, and its operational rhythms. By any measure, he was not a professional chauffeur. His role was security management, not the transportation of guests. Furthermore, by all available accounts, he took considerable pride in his work. His colleagues characterized him as meticulous and discreet, embodying the professionalism required in an environment like the Ritz. He possessed a private pilot's license and was fluent in multiple languages, indicating a carefully cultivated career. On the night of August 30th, Henri Paul was not originally scheduled to work. He had been off duty and had departed the hotel earlier in the evening. He was recalled when the plan involving a decoy vehicle and a rear exit was being organized. He returned to the Ritz and agreed to drive. What transpired within Henri Paul's body in the hours between his departure from duty and his return to the driver's seat of that Mercedes became a central question in every subsequent investigation. The official French toxicological report, conducted posthumously, determined that Henri Paul's blood alcohol level at the time of the crash was approximately 3 times the legal limit for driving in France. The report also identified traces of prescription medications, specifically a combination of drugs used to treat anxiety and a condition related to alcohol dependence. These findings were challenged almost immediately. Henri Paul's family and certain independent experts raised concerns regarding the procedures employed in the collection and testing of the samples. Questions were posed concerning the accuracy of sample identification and the potential for contamination. The debate surrounding the toxicology results became, for a period, one of the most technically intricate arguments within the broader investigation, involving pathologists, blood specialists, and forensic scientists whose opinions did not always align. A second examination was commissioned. Its results were consistent with the initial findings. For the official inquiries, both the French investigation and the much later British inquest concluded in 2008, the determination was that Henri Paul was significantly impaired when he took control of the vehicle. However, here lies the complicating factor. Witnesses who observed Henri Paul within the Ritz that evening, prior to his driving, provided accounts that varied considerably. Some perceived him as perfectly normal. Others suggested he had been drinking. Still others reported no indication that anything was amiss. A waiter who served him recalled him appearing relaxed. Another staff member observed nothing unusual. Security footage from inside the Ritz depicted Henri Paul engaged in conversation, walking and moving in ways that different analysts interpreted diversely. Some experts reviewing the footage opined that his movements were consistent with someone who had consumed alcohol. Others contended that the footage alone was insufficient for definitive conclusions. The question of his actual level of apparent impairment and how this might have been discernible haunted the investigation for years. Then there was the matter of speed and the tunnel. The route from the Ritz on Place Vendôme to Dodi's apartment near the Arc de Triomphe was not extensive. Under normal circumstances, it would take approximately 10 to 15 minutes, depending on traffic conditions. The car followed a path along the right bank of the Seine, heading west. This route led them through the Pont de l'Alma Tunnel, which runs beneath the Place de l'Alma, generally following the course of the river. The Pont de l'Alma Tunnel, by the standards of major urban roadways, is not an exceptionally complex or perilous stretch of road. It features a slight curve as it passes under the plaza above. At the time of the crash, the speed limit was 50 kilometers per hour, approximately 31 miles per hour. The Mercedes entered the tunnel at a velocity that investigators later estimated to be between 90 and 120 kilometers per hour. Some analyses suggested it may have been traveling even faster at certain points. Within the tunnel, the vehicle collided with a white Fiat Uno. The precise nature of that collision, whether it was a direct impact, a glancing blow, or a near miss that caused the driver to lose control, became one of the most heavily debated aspects of the entire investigation. The white Fiat Uno departed the scene and was never conclusively identified. Its driver was never located, despite one of the most exhaustive searches for a single vehicle in European investigative history. Following its contact with the Fiat, the Mercedes struck the 13th pillar within the tunnel. The impact was catastrophic. The car spun violently and came to rest facing the opposite direction of its travel. It was approximately 12:23 in the morning on August 31st, 1997. In the immediate aftermath, the first individuals to reach the vehicle were not emergency personnel, but photographers. Several paparazzi, who had been following the Mercedes on motorcycles, arrived at the scene within seconds of the crash. This fact became one of the most contentious elements of the subsequent events. Photographs were taken inside the tunnel in the immediate aftermath. Some of these were published, while others were suppressed by court order. The question of whether the photographers impeded the ability of the first medical responders to reach the victims was raised in court and was never definitively resolved. A witness who was traversing the tunnel at the time of the crash later provided testimony detailing what they observed in the moments following the impact. Their account described the car positioned across the roadway, with steam or smoke emanating from it, and individuals, some with cameras, converging on the wreckage almost instantly. The witness recounted their attempt to assist and the difficulty in reaching the car due to the throng of people already gathered around it. French emergency services arrived at the scene and discovered 4 occupants within the vehicle. Trevor Rees-Jones, a bodyguard employed by the Fayed family, was in the front passenger seat. He sustained severe injuries but was alive, and he had been wearing a seatbelt. Henri Paul, the driver, was pronounced dead at the scene. In the rear seat, both Dodi Al-Fayed and Diana were found to be in critical condition. Dodi was pronounced deceased at the scene, his injuries from the impact unsurvivable. Diana was still alive. What transpired over the ensuing hours, the decisions made by French medical personnel regarding her treatment, the route taken to the hospital, and the elapsed time before she reached a surgical theatre became another area of intense scrutiny, examined in detail during the British inquest over a decade later. The French medical system's approach to emergency trauma at the time differed significantly from the British approach. In France, the standard protocol prioritized stabilizing a patient at the scene before transport. In Britain, the emphasis was on transporting the patient to a hospital as swiftly as possible, a philosophy sometimes termed scoop and run. Diana remained at the scene and received extensive treatment before being transported to the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital, located approximately 6 kilometers from the tunnel. The journey itself, undertaken at a slow speed to prevent further injury, consumed additional time. Upon arrival at the hospital, she was immediately taken into surgery. The injury she had sustained was to the pulmonary vein, the vessel responsible for transporting oxygenated blood from the lungs to the heart, an injury exceptionally difficult to survive under any circumstances. The surgical team worked for hours. At 4 o'clock in the morning, on August 31st, 1997, Diana, Princess of Wales, was pronounced dead. Dodi Al-Fayed was 42 years old at the time of his death, while Diana was 36. The investigation and France's conclusions. The French investigation into the crash spanned approximately 3 years. Judge Hervé Stéphan presided over the inquiry, which was formally classified as an investigation into involuntary manslaughter. The primary focus was on whether Henri Paul's condition at the time of driving constituted criminal negligence and on the conduct of the photographers pursuing the vehicle. The investigation gathered testimony from hundreds of witnesses. It meticulously analyzed the physical evidence from the crash site, the vehicle, the tunnel, and the surrounding streets. Considerable resources were dedicated to pursuing the identity of the white Fiat Uno. In September of 1999, Judge Stéphan concluded the investigation and dismissed all charges against the photographers who had been following the car. The judge determined that while the photographers had indeed pursued the vehicle, there was insufficient evidence to establish that their presence had directly caused Henri Paul to drive as he did, nor that they had obstructed emergency response in a manner that could be criminally proven. The conclusion of the French investigation was that the crash was attributable to Henri Paul's impaired driving and excessive speed. The white Fiat Uno was identified as a likely significant contributing factor in the sequence of events, representing the obstacle to which Henri Paul reacted within the tunnel. However, its driver was never apprehended. The Fiat itself was believed to belong to a French photographer named James Andanson, who was in Paris that evening. Andanson died in May of 2000 under circumstances ruled a suicide by French authorities, although this too became a point of contention for those who suspected a more deliberate act. Physical evidence from Andanson's vehicle exhibited traces consistent with involvement in a collision, though French investigators concluded this was not conclusive proof that it was the car involved in the tunnel incident. Mohammed Al-Fayed, Dodi's father, unequivocally rejected the conclusions of the French investigation. From the outset, he maintained that his son and Diana had been deliberately murdered, asserting that the event was not an accident. Mohammed Al-Fayed's perspective. Mohammed Al-Fayed's grief over the loss of his son was by all accounts profound and absolute. He had lost a child. Regardless of the complex dynamics that characterized their relationship over the years, and they were indeed complex, with Dodi often navigating the immense shadow cast by his father's wealth and reputation, Dodi was his son. In the months and years following the crash, Mohammed Al-Fayed emerged as the most vocal and persistent advocate, arguing that the events in the Pont de l'Alma Tunnel were not accidental. His central contention was that Diana and Dodi met their demise due to their impending marriage and Diana's pregnancy with Dodi's child. He posited that the British establishment, specifically factions linked to the royal family, orchestrated their deaths to preclude this union and the birth of a child whose father was of Muslim and Egyptian heritage. Mohammed Al-Fayed articulated these assertions publicly, repeatedly, and with considerable conviction. He identified specific individuals and presented what he believed was corroborating evidence for his narrative. He commissioned investigations, engaged with members of parliament, and persistently advocated for a comprehensive public inquiry in Britain, which was eventually granted. The British inquest, officially titled The Inquests into the Deaths of Diana, Princess of Wales, and Emad Mohammed Al-Fayed, commenced in October 2007 and concluded in April 2008. Presided over by Lord Justice Scott Baker, it involved testimony from over 250 witnesses over more than 6 months, becoming one of the most protracted and costly inquests in British legal history. The jury's verdict, delivered on April 7, 2008, was unlawful killing, but not in the manner Mohammed Al-Fayed had proposed. The British inquest's findings revealed that the jury concluded Diana and Dodi were unlawfully killed as a consequence of the grossly negligent driving by Henri Paul, compounded by the similarly negligent driving of the pursuing photographer's vehicles. This verdict refuted Mohammed Al-Fayed's conspiracy theories. The jury found no evidence of a premeditated plot, a staged accident, or deliberate interference. Instead, their finding was, in its own way, more profoundly disturbing. The two individuals perished due to a driver who should not have been operating a vehicle at a dangerously excessive speed through a tunnel late at night, with a convoy of photographers dangerously pursuing them for a photograph. The inquest meticulously examined every facet of the conspiracy claims put forth by Mohammed Al-Fayed, including the pregnancy assertion, the engagement ring, the alleged involvement of British intelligence services, Henri Paul's movements and contacts, the photographer's actions, and the medical treatment Diana received. Regarding the pregnancy, pathological examinations yielded no evidence that Diana was pregnant at the time of her passing. Concerning the engagement ring, testimony from Reposi presented an ambiguous picture. While evidence suggested Dodi had shown interest in the ring and it had been delivered to the Ritz, there was no conclusive proof of a formal proposal. Witnesses from intelligence services testified regarding the alleged British intelligence involvement. The jury was presented with extensive documentation, and the verdict did not support the claim that any agency had arranged or participated in causing the crash. Nevertheless, the inquest also heard testimony illustrating a degree of chaos, miscommunication, and dysfunction surrounding that night's events, which was genuinely difficult to reconcile with any semblance of normalcy. The decision to employ a decoy vehicle, the last-minute change of driver, the chosen route, the speed, the tunnel, each element in isolation might have seemed explicable or even reasonable at the time, but collectively they culminated in a tragic outcome. Trevor Rees-Jones and the seatbelt issue. One detail from that night remains indelible once known. Of the 4 occupants in the Mercedes S280 on the night of August 30th, 1997, only one wore a seatbelt. Trevor Rees-Jones, the bodyguard in the front passenger seat, survived. Henri Paul, Dodi Al-Fayed, and Diana, Princess of Wales, were not wearing seatbelts and did not survive. Trevor Rees-Jones sustained severe injuries, necessitating extensive reconstructive surgery to his face. His jaw, cheekbones, and other facial structures were damaged to such an extent that multiple operations were required over a considerable period. He has spoken about his experience publicly only rarely and with evident difficulty. He has stated he has no recollection of the events within the tunnel, his memory ceasing some time before the crash and resuming only when he was hospitalized. His book, published in 2000, was met with a mixture of empathy and skepticism. Some felt he was withholding information, while others believed the trauma and physical damage had erased the very memories the world so desperately sought. Neurological memory loss following severe trauma is well documented and can be complete, with the brain, under certain types of impact, simply failing to record events. What Rees-Jones described was consistent with this. However, for those eager to understand the final moments in the tunnel, his silence on the matter was deeply painful. The seatbelt issue was investigated during the French inquiry and again during the British inquest. The inquest received evidence concerning the prevalent culture surrounding seatbelt use within the security operation employed by the Fayed family. It was established that seatbelt use was not consistently enforced or encouraged. This seemingly simple detail has been revisited repeatedly by investigators, journalists, and the public over the years, not as an explanation for the larger mysteries, but as a stark reminder of the physical vulnerability of the situation. It was not merely a historical event. It involved a car, a tunnel, and 4 human beings. Dodi's father and the subsequent years. Mohammed Al-Fayed never accepted the conclusions of either the French investigation or the British inquest. He continued to publicly assert his conviction that his son had been murdered and to fund research into the crash. He maintained the memorial to Dodi and Diana at Harrods, which for many years was one of the most visited and discussed exhibits in any retail establishment globally. This display featured photographs of Dodi and Diana, items linked to the alleged engagement ring, and a golden pyramid dedicated to their memory. It was a deeply personal monument created by a father who believed public grief and public accusation were inseparable. Mohammed Al-Fayed sold Harrods in 2010 to the Qatar Investment Authority, and the memorial was removed as part of the transaction. He continued to give interviews on the subject of his son's death for years thereafter, his position remaining unwavering. In August 2023, Mohammed Al-Fayed passed away at the age of 94. In the weeks following his death, a significant number of women came forward with accounts of alleged sexual misconduct committed by Mohammed Al-Fayed over many decades. These allegations were serious, numerous, and spanned a lengthy period. They were reported by major news organizations and prompted a substantial re-evaluation of his public legacy. This context is relevant to the story of Dodi Al-Fayed's death in one specific regard. It complicates the already intricate portrayal of the man who, for over a quarter of a century, was the most prominent and vocal proponent of the theory that his son had been murdered. Dodi himself is not implicated in these allegations. However, the father who dedicated decades to being the primary advocate for his son's memory has become a far more complex figure in the years since his own passing. The tunnel today, the Pont de l'Alma Tunnel in Paris, still exists, with vehicles traversing it daily. Above the tunnel entrance, on the plaza level, stands a flame, a replica of the Statue of Liberty's flame, gifted to France by the United States as a symbol of friendship. It was installed years before the crash and was intended to represent Franco-American relations. However, in the weeks following August 31st, people began leaving flowers, photographs, and notes at the base of this flame. By popular consensus, and without any official designation, the flame became a memorial to Diana. It continues to serve this purpose today, with tourists visiting and leaving flowers. There is no official memorial to Dodi at the site, nor is there a plaque bearing his name. In death, as in life, he occupied the passenger seat. What the evidence actually shows. Across 3 decades, multiple investigations, hundreds of witnesses, thousands of pages of documentation, and one of the longest inquests in British legal history, the picture that emerges is as follows. On the night of August 30th, 1997, a driver who was unfit to drive took the wheel of a car in Paris. He proceeded at a speed entirely inappropriate for the road. Something occurred within the tunnel, a collision with another vehicle, a near miss, or a combination of both, causing him to lose control. The car impacted a pillar. 3 people perished. The photographers pursuing the car contributed to the circumstances that led to this chain of events. The occupants of the car were not wearing seatbelts. The route was chosen hastily, under pressure, to evade the very photographers who ultimately followed them. There was no conspiracy, no covert directive, no deliberate intervention. There was an impaired driver, a car traveling too fast, and a tunnel. And in the passenger seat was Dodi Al-Fayed, a man who had spent most of his life in his father's shadow, who had found something that appeared to bring him genuine happiness in his final weeks, and who was 42 years old, with no reason to anticipate that August 30th would differ from the preceding nights. The investigations reached their conclusions, and the jury delivered its verdict. The lingering questions are largely not about what transpired, but rather about how it happened. The decisions made, the conditions allowed to persist, and the pressures that placed those 4 individuals in that car that night. It is worth contemplating this for a moment, as the most difficult aspect of this narrative's conclusion is not its mystery, but its very absence of mystery. In the end, it was a series of ordinary failures, a driver who should not have driven, a hastily chosen route, a tunnel with a speed limit disregarded by all. These factors culminated in an event that the world is still, nearly 3 decades later, struggling to accept as reality. The legacy of Dodi Al-Fayed. Dodi Al-Fayed is remembered, to the extent that he is remembered at all, primarily in connection with Diana. His name appears alongside hers, and his death is described as having occurred with hers. This is unsurprising and not entirely unfair, given that their relationship was real and ended simultaneously. However, he was a person who existed for 42 years before that tunnel incident. He produced films, maintained friendships, had a complex family life and a complicated history, and lived a life that by many accounts was genuinely his own, not merely a supporting role in another's story. His production company, Allied Stars, continued to operate for some time after his death. His contributions to Chariots of Fire are documented and undeniable. The film remains one of the most celebrated British productions of the 20th century, and his name is among the credits. Individuals who worked with him in the film industry recall him with warmth, though some also remember him as someone still, in certain ways, discovering his identity outside of his father's world. There is a quiet sadness in this. A person who spent decades striving to forge an identity separate from an immense inheritance, only to become defined in death not by his own achievements, but by his companion at the time of his passing. His friends from the film world have given interviews over the years, describing a man who could be extravagantly generous, who possessed a genuine, rather than fashionable, love for movies, and who had a particular consideration for those in less prominent positions on productions, the crew members and assistants whom most wealthy producers scarcely noticed. These details rarely make headlines. The question of who Dodi Al-Fayed was becoming in that summer, whether he was at a turning point, whether his relationship with Diana held lasting potential, whether the ring and the plans and the possibility were real, cannot be answered now. What can be stated is that he was present, that he was alive, that he had a name, a history, and a laugh captured in candid photographs aimed at something just outside the frame. And on August 31st, 1997, in a tunnel beneath Paris, that life came to an end. The Pont de l'Alma Tunnel has been widened since 1997. The pillars within have been repositioned and the road markings altered. The tunnel looks different now than it did on that fateful night, yet the flame above it continues to burn. And the questions, not the conspiracy theories, but the profound human inquiries about how such events occur, about the decisions that lead to irreversible moments, about individuals reduced to footnotes in their own narratives, these questions do not truly vanish, they simply fade with time. Dodi Al-Fayed was the man in the passenger seat. He did not drive, he did not select the route, and he did not make the decisions that shaped those final minutes. He was simply there, and then he was gone.